Hello, am I on? Hi, um, my name is B. Duddy. I'm giving the presentation on tulpamancy, myths and facts. Tulpamancy is a subject within plurality that I've seen cause a lot of confusion and misunderstanding and sometimes conflict. I see a lot of myths going around, and I hope that I can dispel them during this presentation with some facts. I'm going to go over the what tulpamancy is, what the community looks like, what a tulpa system is, and comparisons and contrasts with other forms of plurality. I would really appreciate if you have any questions at all about what I'm saying or about tulpamancy in general. Please feel free to ask them in the YouTube chat. They're going to be shown to me. If they're applicable to what I'm talking about at that time, I'll try to answer them right away. If they're not, then I have a time for questions at the end of the presentation where I can answer any kind of questions. Please feel free to ask about anything. Again, here's some of the general topics that I'm going to cover. Basically, what is tulpamancy? The history of the subject from its beginnings through today, tulpa creation and development, comparisons with other plurality, the communities, media, and research, and finally the conclusion, as I said, an opportunity for general questions. So first off, what is tulpamancy? Tulpamancy is the theory and practice of creating tulpas. Well, that probably doesn't answer your question. So what is a tulpa? The definition, like a lot of definitions in this community, is not 100% clear, but the one that I and most of the community currently use is a deliberately created systemate. I know this is a plural conference, but just in case you're not 100% up on the lingo, that would be a person that shares your body, your brain. Now, again, as I said, that definition is not 100% clear. There are some people in the community that don't believe tulpas fully should be called people. That's a lot less popular opinion than it used to be. There are also people that believe that they don't really share your body, that there's some kind of spiritual stuff going on, something like that. But this is the common definition, the common understanding of the community. And you might be wondering, why do people use silly words like tulpa and tulpamancy and some of the other terms you'll hear during this presentation? Tulpa I'll get to in a moment. Tulpamancy, it's a sort of silly magic thing. Sounds like necromancy or something like that. It is, a sort of silly term, a magical sounding term. It's not 100% serious. People like that. People like that it sounds cool. And like a lot of terms, once it becomes a popular thing, it's sort of hard to change. A couple notes on that definition. When I say deliberate, that's not always the same as intentional. So in order for someone to be considered a tulpa, it doesn't mean that you have to have sat down and thought, I'm going to create a tulpa. There are a lot of cases where, for example, someone will be thinking a lot about a character. For example, they're writing in a book, or even as an imaginary friend that maybe doesn't originally think or act separately from you. And the way you think about them and relate to them becomes essentially the same as what you do to create a tulpa, and then it happens. There's, again, the definitions are not 100% clear. Some people say that they're accidental tulpas. It's not always 100% clear cut. And then another thing is that the creator of a tulpa does not have to be the host / original of a system. Of course, that is the most common situation, but it's not necessarily always the case. Just a side note about this funny picture on the side, there's actually an article online on a website called WikiHow, which has a lot of how-tos about how to create a tulpa, and they have a very unique art style, which you can see in this picture here. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of how tulpamancy became a thing and how it got to how it is today. So the tulpamancy comes from a rare, sort of niche practice in Tibetan Buddhism. We really don't know much about it, actually, even within the Tulpa community. There aren't a lot of solid sources on it, not a lot of, there's really no cross-pollination with the community, and not a lot of solid sources or research on it. But it's happened for a long time. And again, it's not a common practice in Buddhism or even Tibetan Buddhism. It's quite rare. But basically, they go through intense meditation. It's sort of a spiritual practice. They believe that they create, sort of a separate person, but there's a lot of religious or even magical stuff involved, depending on your point of view. And then often they actually are said to dissipate or get rid of their tulpa afterwards as part of their religious practices. Another thing is they don't call them tulpas. The way they pronounce the word is more like sprolpa. And the way we actually got the word tulpa is in 1929, a European explorer, and I put the word in quotes, Alexandra David Neal, writes an account of her travels in Tibet, as you see in the little picture over here, called Magic and Mystery in Tibet. She did travel through Tibet for some years, partook in the above practice and many other Tibetan religious practices. At least she said she did. She's the one that coined the word tulpas. No one really knows why she transcribed it that way. And she wrote stories of her making a tulpa and the tulpa doing things, physically outside of her body, and a lot of other things that even if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, are probably pretty difficult to believe, just to be blunt there. However, the book was quite popular. It was really one of the first accounts of life in Tibet at all at that time. And, spiritualism was a pretty big thing back then. So the book was quite popular. It made a lasting impact on, sort of New Age and mystical people over here in the West. So in the next several decades, that book and some of the ideas that it spawned had sort of occasional bursts of mild popularity here in the United States and elsewhere. You had small groups practicing things like that. Some of the ideas are even passed down among families in terms of some of the ideas of making tulpas and things like that. I see a question, would that be like a Patronus? I assume from Harry Potter. I think some of the things you described might have been a little bit like that. I haven't actually read the book. I probably should, because it's sort of the origin of this whole community. I think what she said is her quote unquote tulpa actually became, evil and acted outside of her control at some point, which is why she claimed she had to get rid of it. So not necessarily quite like a Patronus, but a similar concept, at least what she described. So now we come to the more modern community and the internet. So in 2011, we have a few people that post stories on the 4chan board X, which the topic and title of that board is paranormal. I don't go on 4chan in case you're wondering, but I do know a little bit about it. And a big thing people do on that board is they post basically scary stories. They're called creepypastas because, you copy and paste them. And also they're creepy. And a couple of those stories, people, they were about tulpas. And of course, because they were creepy stories, it was about tulpas taking over their hosts, tulpas doing scary things, making people go insane, stuff like that. I'm not exactly sure why. I assume that those people had read the book. Again, it is sort of still a reasonably known book today. So maybe they read it for school as part of a research project, something like that. But basically, there were a couple creepy stories posted about tulpas on that board. And other people ended up replying that tulpas are actually real, that they were part of this tradition of families making tulpas or something like that. So they said, no, this isn't, well, yes, you can write a spooky story, but it's not just a scary thing. You can actually do this. You can make someone in your head that does stuff, independent from you, at least in thought, not in physical terms. So other people, of course, were interested, and they replied, and they talked about it, and tulpas became a popular subject on that board. There were topics about them, there were posts, and people started to share information and guides and tips on how to create tulpas, how to do things with them, stuff like that. The Tulpamancy community has a really big culture about sharing guides, sharing information, things like that. The next year, sometime in 2012, Tulpamancy as a topic was ultimately banned from X. I like to say that it's because tulpas were actually real, and that's not appropriate for that board, apparently. But again, I wasn't around. The community obviously sort of split. They looked around for a new place, and ultimately they settled on 4chan's MLP board for My Little Pony. Again, I can't say exactly why. I know that this was really at the height of the My Little Pony Friendship is Magic boom. My Little Pony based tulpas were already very popular. And, it was sort of a friendly, accepting place that was willing to take in that kind of discussion. And you can see sort of over here, an old topic that sort of combines the pony and creepypasta parts of that community. Another popular gathering place in 2012 was IRC, Internet Relay Chat, sort of very old-fashioned chat rooms. Throughout the next couple of years, other tulpa-related communities sprung up. There's of course the R Tulpas subreddit on Reddit, some websites called tulpa.io and tulpa.info, the latter being the one that's really more popular now. And after Discord was created in 2015, the chat app, that became a very popular place for the Tulpa community as well. And through this whole time, and I'll get more into this in a little bit, the community became more diverse, springing from original 4chan roots, learns more about tulpas, about what they are, things that work, things that don't, and becomes more open to other forms of plurality and sharing information with them. Just a side note before I go on, this is obviously about the English language community. I really only speak English, so that's what I know about. There are a couple other communities I'll get to in a bit that have different timelines, and I wish I could go more into detail about them, but I just don't know that information. So the Tulpamancy community today is mostly based on Discord, Reddit, r/tulpas, and a couple others. Tulpa.info is the probably the most popular remaining Tulpa-based site, and they also have a Discord channel, and still a little bit on 4chan, though not very much. On the right, actually, you see a screenshot from Tulpa Chat. It is the official Discord server of r/tulpas. It's, I believe, the biggest Tulpa-related Discord server. And I actually am the current manager of Tulpa Chat. I wasn't originally, but the previous one stepped down and gave the position to me. So if you are interested, feel free to check it out. You can find a link on r/tulpas. The current communities are really wide-ranging. There are some devoted exclusively to tulpas and talking about tulpas, sharing information. Others simply about offering place to chat about anything, but just accepting what tulpas are, and tulpas talking to tulpas, and people understanding tulpas and not asking weird questions. Tulpa Chat, I can say, is a mix of those. There are other communities that are more help-based and more chat-based. Many tulpamancers are still creating and reading guides on various aspects of tulpamancy, especially, a lot of guides on creating tulpas in the first place, because that's not always easy, although I'll get to that more in a bit. There's always, a lot of people asking for help, a lot of people getting help. People always want to share and help each other. And of course, whenever I say people, lots of tulpas and hosts active in these communities. Actually, over here in the Tulpa Chat screenshot, all of the people, this is a complete accident, but all of the people talking in this screenshot are tulpas that I know. And you can see sort of the three different ways that that happens. The one at the top, that is Tulpa as a separate account of their own. Below you see the original way that happened, which is a Tulpa using brackets to indicate that they're talking rather than their host, and you see in their username that they're both listed. And then the third one, where you see Elise, that's actually a Discord bot, or one of several Discord bots that was created by the community. If you're on Discord, a plurality-related Discord, you've probably seen this already, but if you haven't, basically they can type in these brackets, and then the bot will automatically delete that message and then recreate it with the proper name and profile picture, different from their hosts. Of course, the host can use the bot as well. I have on a couple occasions. But yeah, it's very nice and convenient, and there are a lot of different communities. As I said there, I know of significant communities existing in Japan. That one was actually started independently in the mid-2000s. I don't know the exact details. And one in Russia, which I believe is actually a lot bigger than the English language one. They have a lot of sites. They've actually had in-person meetups, which is not a thing we've had here in the US. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of cross-pollination between English and Russian. Maybe we should try sometime. But it's definitely a big community over there as well. Of course, there are communities in other languages as well. Interaction with other communities over time. So obviously the Tulpa community has a lot of different interactions. As I mentioned before, when it was on 4chan, there was a lot of heavy interaction with the My Little Pony community, and that is not nearly as present today, but is still there to some extent. There's a significant overlap with people that are interested in lucid dreaming, in hypnosis, and other kinds of, I just came up with the term mental exploration, sort of a catch-all for types of things people are interested in. Most of us understand that tulpamancy is a lot more than that, but it's certainly part of what gets people into it, just trying to see the things that are possible to do with your mind, with your brain. And you see a lot of shared interests in things like that. There's also some overlap with spiritual / magical communities, things like that. I've noticed that some people in those communities try to often see tulpas in a somewhat different way, more like tools rather than separate people. Of course, this isn't universal. It's, my personal observation, and doesn't apply to everyone by any means, but it does happen, and it sometimes causes conflict. There is a very high prevalence of transgender tulpamancers, which I haven't seen data, but I think may apply to other kinds of plurality as well. There's, some overlap. I think some trans communities have sort of knowledge of tulpas as well. So you see a lot of overlap with there as well. And then, of course, over time, there's been a lot of contact over time with other plural communities, and that, started even a few years after 2011, but has certainly been getting more and more common over time, especially with Discord. And this can sort of be seen in the sharing of terminology, and not always 100% perfect sharing, which I'll get into later, and the way that tulpas and systems within the tulpa community are perceived. I think this is more my theory, but I think that a lot of that comes from increasing contact with the rest of the plural community. Here's some ways that the tulpa community, has changed over time. I think one of the biggest changes, and this is, this goes into a lot of the perception of what people see about the tulpa community and what people think about it. And I think this is one of those things that maybe the bad things people think, they were probably more true in the past than they were now. Because a big change I've seen since I learned about tulpas in about mid-2015, and even more in recent years, is an increasing acceptance of tulpas as people and equal to the host in terms of capabilities and rights, rather than in the beginning, I think a lot of people saw tulpas as lesser than the host, or maybe even more like playthings, things to have fun with, rather than people. It's obviously a really complex subject, something that's difficult to talk about. Again, I wasn't around the community in the early days, so I can't say for sure. But definitely over the last few years, there have been more understandings that tulpas can grow to be the same as the host, or equal to the host, or even stronger than the host, depending on what happens. Understanding that doesn't always need to be the host making decisions, that, systems with tulpas can be equal to each other. It doesn't always need to be the host and then everyone else. It also doesn't always need to be the host deciding things for the tulpas. And this sort of goes into the next point, where in the early days, it was very common and very accepted to make a tulpa that was based off an existing character. And I know I mentioned the association with My Little Pony earlier. There were a lot of pony tulpas out there, a lot. I'm told that there was on the IRC chat, there was once a room exclusively for Twilight Sparkles, and I think there were over 20 at one point. This being told to me by a former Twilight Sparkle. So yeah, and a lot of times, in the old days, they created a tulpa to basically be that character. They wanted to have a pony in their head or whatever, so they created a tulpa, and the tulpa was that character. This is not completely in the same sense as, like being a fictive or a soulbound or whatever. But there wasn't like a lot of, choice involved. It was like, you are this character, you act like this character, you look like this character. That still happens to some extent, but it's not nearly as common, and maybe not even quite as accepted. I think, when it happens now, it's more like they're based on this character, and almost universally it's given this advice that you should allow them to change if they want to. And then this goes into the next point, where a lot of the old guides and advice given to people creating tulpas were to basically predetermine a lot of their aspects, their name, their gender, their form, what they quote unquote looked like, and even their personality. A lot of the old guides on how to create tulpas focused a lot on that, on doing many of those things, on spending great amounts of time on them and doing them in a lot of detail. And now, especially in the last few years, it's really changed so that people say you don't have to do that, or maybe you shouldn't even do that. I can say that when I created the tulpa, I didn't really do any of that. I didn't predetermine anything about what she ended up being, and it worked pretty well. And I see a lot of other people using that same method. So that's another big change in the community, and something that, you may have heard that people do a lot of the first one, and that was true certainly in the past, and just not as true anymore now. And again, there's not a formal connection, but I think this is related. Tulpa creation takes a lot less time now than it did years ago. It used to be that people would expect to set aside months, maybe even more than a year, when they were trying to create a tulpa before they got any evidence there actually was something there. Now, the average time is maybe a couple weeks, sometimes even a couple days. It used to be someone who came to the community and said in a couple days they have a tulpa would be laughed out of the room. Now it's basically accepted. I think part of that comes with expectations. When you're doing something in your mind, I always like to say expectations become reality pretty quickly. Another big part is the guides and methods. A lot of the old guides, as I said, had people spend a lot of time and effort on, imagining their form, or trying to give them certain personality traits, rather than, suffice to say that I don't believe, and a lot of other people don't believe, that those methods are actually really effective in making a tulpa. And I think people now, they do things that actually are, and that leads to the process happening a lot faster. So this is what I was sort of getting into. How does one make a tulpa? Obviously, this is a very cut down an abbreviated version of the process. There are many guides. They go into a lot of details, a lot of tips. There's a guide actually that's over 200 pages. It's not all about how to make a tulpa. There's advice on what to do and things you can do once you have one. Need to silence my phone, I'm sorry. But basically this is an abbreviated version of the process, how to make a tulpa. Again, the methods have definitely changed over time. Earlier guides emphasized focus on exacting details of a predetermined form of personality, whether that was of a existing fictional character or something you made up yourself. But most of the modern advice I've seen people giving out these days focuses on variations of the following key principle: talk to someone in your head until they talk back. Of course, this comes from the perspective of being a singlet or not having, or trying to make a tulpa that's not already there. So you're talking to someone that's not actually there yet, or that you don't know is there yet. And that causes a lot of confusion. People don't get it. People don't understand what they do or how they're supposed to listen. But basically, the key point of the process is pretend like there's already a tulpa in your head, another person in your head. Talk to them usually in mind voice. You don't have to do it out loud. It's really not recommended. I guess you can if you want to, but mind voice is fine. Talk to them about stuff. Talk to them about what you're doing in your life. Talk to them about what you might do together, about what they might be, about maybe what you want them to be. Again, you can do this without predetermining everything. And this is usually called narration in the community, but basically just talk to them about all kinds of stuff. And listen until you hear a thought or a voice or even a minor headache that isn't yours. Obviously, if you're not used to being plural, this is a very weird thing to do and can cause a lot of confusion and doubt. I was lucky that my tulpa was very clear when she first talked to me, but for a lot of people, it's not. A lot of people, it's hearing emotions, hearing unclear ideas. Again, maybe the first thing is feeling a strange minor headache in their head. We call them head pressures. And that's often considered to be evidence of a tulpa, or at least evidence that your brain is doing something weird and thus giving you a headache. And then, once you hear something, talk back to that and keep going from there. A term that's often used in the community that comes from the very beginning is called forcing. It's not meant to be forcing a tulpa to do something. It comes from the idea that you're forcing them to exist. I didn't come up with this word. And it's even been expanded really broadly to mean like any kind of interaction with a forming tulpa, or even sometimes a formed tulpa. I don't consider it a good term for several reasons. I think it's confusing. I think it makes it sound a lot harder than it is. I think it obscures the key point of talking to them and doing stuff with them. But the term lives on. Terms are very hard to change. That's why we still call them tulpas, despite having very little to do with what the Buddhists, monks in Tibet do. I thought I turned that reminder thing off. You'll also hear a lot about two separate kinds of forcing: passive forcing, which is forcing while doing something else, i.e. You're doing something in your daily life, you're going to school, you're taking a walk, and you're talking to your tulpa in your mind while you're doing that. And active forcing, which is just doing forcing. So basically a kind of meditation. You sit or lie down, you imagine your tulpa's form, you're just talking to them, and that's all that you're doing. That's a common point in the tulpa community is what, should I do this? Should I do a specific ratio? Should I set aside time for active forcing? Again, I think a lot of these discussions are counterproductive and sort of obscure the point of doing things with them or talking to them helps, but they continue. And again, I sort of alluded to this earlier, it's still considered generally acceptable to predetermine some aspects of the tulpa, like their form, their mind form, what they look like internally, or their name or their gender, or perhaps even their personality. It's still considered generally acceptable to do that and to make that part of your forcing, to telling them who they are, to imagining their form, things like that, as long as you give them the opportunity to change that once they have the capability to do so. And that has its own term. It's called deviation, which again comes from the days when most tulpas were based on pre-existing characters. When you change from what that character is, what they look like, what they act like, was considered a notable thing. So you had to make a term for it. It was called deviation. Now it's not really a big deal. Tulpas are more seen as people. They're expected to learn and grow and change like any other person. So you don't hear as much talk about that. But it is still a sort of paradigm that existed and exists to some extent. Again, feel free to ask questions at any time, or if you are and they're not immediately relevant, I'll get to them at the end. But feel free to ask questions about what I'm talking about right now if there's anything you want me to clarify or address. So tulpa development. So again, you've been talking to them, you've been forcing, they've talked back, and you have a tulpa, and that's great. So there are a lot of skills that come easily or naturally to other types of systems, at least in some cases, that are not necessarily easy for tulpa systems. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm told by the host that she's holding over a dozen questions, so I will get to them later, I promise. Just if you have anything that's immediately applicable, she can post that and I can answer it right away. So again, skills like that are not always easy for tulpas. The key one is switching. Obviously the key point of a lot of other systems is that they switch. For tulpas, that's not easy at all. It can be it's something that has to be practiced. It has to be trained. Some people report that it takes years for them to be able to do that. Of course, other systems, they can do it right away. There are a lot of things that differ a lot. But the average is certainly that it's not easy and it takes practice. In fact, young tulpas, maybe a few months old, often have a hard time, being active, being able to think and process and act separately without active attention from their host. Being co-conscious, I think it's the proper term. This is again something that can be trained, that can be practiced and can get a lot stronger. But it's certainly not easy at the beginning. Tulpas basically start out as sort of mental babies. They don't have a lot of energy. They don't have a lot of capability to think and act and do things on their own. And that certainly doesn't have to remain the case for long, and not nearly as long as was commonly believed in the past. But it is a thing. And young tulpas actually often seem to rest after relatively small amounts of activity and sort of become mentally inactive. And that's a really common thing that's seen in the community that worries new hosts, that they're like, what happened to my tulpa? And the answer is they're probably resting. Wait a little while and they'll get back to you. So working with tulpas and practicing these skills, starting with just talking to them and moving on to more advanced things like possession, ooh, scary word, I'll get to it in a bit, and switching, helps strengthen them over time. And for most people in the community, they now believe that in time, with this practice, with interacting with them and doing things with them, they can become basically as strong and present as the host / original. And this wasn't always believed to be the case, but these days it usually is. And then this practice, again, there's separate exercises people have developed, but it often is seen to help with co-consciousness, or in Tulpa community, there's a separate term called parallel processing, basically thinking at the same time. And just talking and interacting with them, and also doing special exercises. There's a common one, which is count to 100 while the host or tulpa is doing something else mentally. That's a popular exercise, and it really seems to help. And one of the key points I want to get to is it seems natural to me, at least, and to some others, that this kind of practice and exercise could be useful for other types of plural systems to develop these same kinds of skills. So what is a tulpa system like? Obviously, as I've alluded to earlier, there's no one single answer. There are dramatic differences, and every system is different. There are small ones, big ones, ones that get along extremely well, ones that get along not as well, ones where the host is the original and does all the important things, ones where the original is basically gone, even though they intentionally created their tulpas. That's not as common, but it does happen. But broadly speaking, tulpa systems generally consist of headmates that get along. You see there are sort of these graphs over here on the right that I took from a recent census of the tulpa community. You see that 96% of respondents say that having a tulpa has had positive effects on their life. And I think the respondents include people that don't have a tulpa, so I'm not even sure that the 4.4% is completely accurate. And then you go down to, has having a tulpa had any negative effects on your life? The answer is only 36% yes. So generally people who create tulpas, and I can say that I'm certainly among this, they get along extremely well with their tulpas, they have positive effects, they are happy for having done so. And people can interact with their tulpas in the real world, obviously, not with separate bodies, but just by talking to each other. In what we call wonderlands, you may know them as mindscapes or inner worlds. The term wonderland is sort of a silly one that came from a tulpa called Alice before the tulpa community really talked much with the rest of the plural community. But it's an inner world where people can interact with their tulpas, or vice versa. Or even via a skill called imposition, which is basically imagining your tulpa's form in the real world. And now some people are doing the opposite, which is when switching, having the tulpa imagine their host/original's form in the real world, and that can be fun too, and is another way to interact. Most hosts, and I accidentally put the image for this on another slide. Most hosts are the originals and still spend most of their time fronting and doing things in the real world. This is another thing that has changed over time, and is not universally the case. Surveys have shown that the most common number of tulpas is one, so one host and one tulpa. You see that again from the recent community census here. This very tall bar here is 2 total people, so one host and one tulpa. I don't know why there's a column for 0 total system members, but apparently one person did give that answer. And then you see a sort of fall off. There are definitely much larger systems that do exist. I think they bring the average up to somewhere around 4. I personally know and I'm friends with a system of about 60 that consider themselves tulpas. So I don't know if that sounds big to you, but in the tulpa community, that's very large. Forms vary, certainly. I didn't have space to include that chart, but the most popular is human, but you see a wide range. Certainly ponies were the most popular form for a long time. That's no longer the case, and in fact fictives in general are not as popular as they are now. But you still do see them. You see Pokemon, you see Toho characters, and you see just a lot of stuff. My one tulpa is a human who designed her own form. And there are others like that. There's any kind of form. And then intra-system relationships between people in the same system, always a hot topic. Studies show they are actually quite popular, as are inter-system relationships between tulpas and other tulpas. I know role play is a common thing. And then this other chart, I think I may have neglected to put the text here that I meant to, but most tulpas are actually the opposite gender of the host. That's a pretty common theme. The exception being that, again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of transgender hosts in the community. And in that scenario, the tulpa is almost always the same gender as the host. That's why you see with this chart, it compares host biological sex or body biological sex to tulpa gender, which sort of combines those two facts. And you see that for male hosts, which are the majority, overwhelmingly female tulpas, and with female hosts, mostly male tulpas. So I've used a couple terms. I apologize if I haven't fully defined them. There are also terms that we sort of, as a community, sort of took from the overall plural community and maybe didn't use in exactly the same way they did. That's why this slide is called Some Confusing Words, because they're words that we in the Tulpa community may not use as the same as the rest of the plural community. And if there are any words in Tulpamancy or that I've used that you don't understand, please ask questions of those now so I can get to those. But I will cover the ones that I thought might be confusing. So possession, I don't think is really anything used in the rest of the plural community, but that's a skill in the Tulpa community that basically consists of the tulpa controlling part or all of the body without fully being in front. Now, I don't know if this is something that makes sense for you. This is something that would be possible in your systems. But it's definitely a thing. Again, the term sort of comes from the time before there was a lot of contact with the rest of the plural community, before people understood how switching worked, what it entailed. But it's, I can say from personal experience and from hearing a lot of other people, it's definitely a thing that can happen, that can be done. And this means part or all of the body. So there's partial possession and full possession. And some people think that full possession should count as switching, and there's a lot of debate about this topic. But that's what possession means. And of course, possession is another sort of scary, magical term. And like I said, there are a couple of those in the community. It sounds fun, maybe, depending on your point of view. Again, I didn't make this term, but once we have them, we sort of have to stick with them. Then I come to switching. We definitely have switching in the Tulpa community. It's more than possible for a Tulpa to switch with a host. But when people say switching, I figured out over time that they don't always mean the same thing. They're very different things that people mean when they say switching. Sometimes it just means essentially full body possession, where the tulpa is in full control of the body, but the host is still completely present, able to see things, remember things, and react to things. For other people, it means a state where the tulpa is in control of the body and the host is completely inactive and maybe forms memories and maybe doesn't. A lot of people in the early tulpa community talked about a form of switching where the tulpa was in control of the body and the host was fully immersed in the wonderland / inner world / mindscape, and saw it as basically an lucid dream. And some people considered, and maybe even still consider, that to be the only true form of switching. I actually did a survey or a study of the community, and I showed at least 6 different variations that were commonly used. So it's very unclear. I don't know enough about the rest of the plural community to say which of those match up, which of those don't, but it's definitely not clear. The same goes with fronting. Fronting is not as commonly used in the Tulpa community, but it's becoming more so. Again, there are several variations, and I think it's broadly the same thing that used in most of the plural community, where it means, a tulpa in this case, rather than an alter, being in control of the body and able to perceive things, but there are certain variations. We also use the term walk-in, which I know is taken from other types of plurality, but not quite in the same way. It doesn't mean someone that doesn't necessarily mean someone that apparently came from, for example, a fictional source. It just means a system member or a tulpa, or perhaps you don't want to call them a tulpa, that apparently came about without any input. So obviously most people in the tulpa community start out as singlets. They don't have system members being created without an apparent reason. So this is not something that's generally expected to happen. And there's, some doubt, again, over whether this happens to tulpamancers without some kind of unintentional creation, unintentional forcing. And there's some debate over whether, walk-ins are tulpas, whether they fall under that umbrella, things like that. But again, it's a word that's used in sort of a confusing way that I don't believe fully aligns with the rest of the plural community. Then we come to the word host. As you might have surmised, in the early days of the community, it was simply assumed that the original was also the main fronter and in charge of the entire system. So therefore, host was used for that person and encompassed all of those things. This is not as much the case anymore. There are originals that have gone away. There are systems where the original has not gone away, but the tulpa spends most of the time fronting, things along those lines. So there are differences, but host in this community generally just means the original person. I talked about forcing earlier. I don't think I need to cover it again. And then there's another term that has confused many people, where we use the word metaphysical, often shortened to meta, to mean any kind of magical, spiritual, etc. practices used in the community. The general consensus in the current tulpa community is that, while not particularly well known to science, tulpas operate on exclusively psychological principles, that they are a creation of the mind, that anyone can do it, that there's no kind of, spirits or magic or alternate worlds involved. But there are, people who still hold those views, and they're generally lumped under the term of meta or metaphysical. Here's a topic that's always controversial, and is, maybe a source of some of the myths you've heard about tulpa systems, which is equality. I did say this before, but in the early tulpa community, it was generally considered that the host / original, being the same person, was in charge of everything, in charge of all the important things, of all the meaningful life decisions and less meaningful life decisions. And tulpas were strictly supplementary, people to talk to, people to have fun with, not people that had any meaningful part to play in the real world. Again, I wasn't around there, so I'm sure that wasn't a universal idea, but it was certainly very popular. And this has definitely changed over time in the last 8 years, because I can say it's changed in the last 4 years. The idea of seeing tulpas as equal, seeing them as deserving of rights, as deserving of having a voice, and giving them, equal rights, equal time to do things in the real world, has become far more popular. It's certainly not universal, and it's certainly not easy to do, coming from the perspective of starting out as a singlet and trying to do that. But it's certainly more popular. So over here you can see, this was a survey done in mid-2018, I believe, so somewhat recent. The question is, how much time do you, the host personality, or original, I guess would be a better term, spend in control of the body? Out of 330 respondents, you see more than half still say all the time. Of course, that also includes a lot of people that have young tulpas that may not be even able to control the body, perhaps even don't have tulpas yet, I think, were some of the respondents. But it's still, a thing that's very common. A little less than a third said most of the time. This is the category I would fall under. and then, you see roughly half the time, some of the time, little time, and no time at all, are much less popular, but things that certainly do happen in the Tulpa community. Another thing that has sort of contributed to that is that before it was assumed that tulpas had their own form, for example, a pony, and that was what they were, and the body, that was just yours, the hosts, that was you. Often it's more popular now for hosts to have their own form, their own internal idea of themselves, and not be tied directly to the physical body, maybe not even the body's name. Certainly not universal, certainly not most people, but it's becoming a thing that's increasingly popular in the Tulpa community for hosts to be somewhat dissociated like that. Here are some comparisons to other types of plurality. Again, I'm not an expert, but I am in a lot of more open servers where we've shared a lot of information. Again, Tulpa systems almost have positive relationships overall. As I mentioned with that chart, hosts report that their lives are changed for the better with positive aspects and few negative aspects. I know that that's not the case for all systems. I'm certainly not saying that it's the case for most systems, or should be, that other systems have negative relationships or aren't changed for the better, but I know that unfortunately there are at least often negative aspects. Tulpa systems, if I didn't really mention this before, almost always share their memory and skills with each other fully, or at least mostly. There's very rarely any kind of memory barriers, any kind of consciousness barriers, anything like that between the host and tulpas. Switching is almost always voluntary on all parts, and generally even has to be trained. And then Tulpa systems are relatively small. The most common size, as you saw on that chart, was 2, and the average is probably somewhere around 4 in terms of total. So that would be, the most common being 1 tulpa, the average being maybe about 3. So is tulpamancy a disorder? This is a question that often comes up from new people, from people stumbling across the community on Reddit or somewhere else. Is it a mental disorder? Are people mentally ill? In a word, the answer is no. Obviously, there are a lot of comparisons to DID, dissociative identity disorder. There are very specific criteria for DID, and they are first, that you have multiple identities. Obviously, tulpas do fit this definition. It's sort of the whole point. So moving on, another criteria for DID is that you have gaps in memory. As I mentioned before, that is extremely rare in tulpa systems. It's not really a thing that happens when you switch with a tulpa. Some try to develop it in small doses to do things like create a surprise for each other or play a game with each other that has hidden information. I've seen a couple people that have tried to develop it on a larger scale, which is not at all something I recommend. But almost universally for tulpa systems, there are not gaps in memory or blackouts, lost time, anything along those lines. It's really just not a thing that happens. Another criteria for DID is significant distress from the experience. As I mentioned before, that is almost never the case with tulpas. There's simply not a lot of distress that's caused. And usually when there is any distress with tulpas, it's issues like, trying to make friends, trying to share things with each other, internal conflicts that aren't necessarily, that are, the kinds of things any two people could have conflicts over. Another criteria for DID is that it's not, in order to qualify DID, something cannot be part of accepted cultural or religious practices. This is sort of debatable with relation to tulpas. It really, one might argue that at least in Tibetan Buddhism they are, but The original Sprolpa creation practice was very rare to begin with, and I really don't think that what we do today has much to do with that. So I'm not sure this applies. And the last criteria is that it's not related to alcohol or drug use. That's usually true. Sometimes people might say things like, oh, if I take this, will it help me create a tulpa? They're usually recommended not to do that. But because two of those criteria are very clearly missed out on, tulpamancy does not qualify as DID. It also does not qualify as OSDD1, which is essentially I don't know if lighter is the right word to use. But basically OSDD1 requires that either there be no gaps in memory or that there not be clearly separate multiple identities. But there still must be some kind of significant distress from the experience, so tulpamancy cannot be that. And I don't know if anyone who knows about plurality would equate them, but we often get on our tulpas, for example, people saying, "Oh, it's schizophrenia." It really doesn't have anything to do with schizophrenia. The hearing voices part is not what makes schizophrenia a disorder. So working together across communities. This is the good part, the part that is happening more and I really think should happen more. There are many all plural communities and a steadily growing number of all plural communities that exist, especially on Discord. In these communities, Tulpa and other systems, traumagenic and endogenic and whatever, commonly work together to discuss and resolve issues, and of course many other things like games, travel, pictures, whatever. I have heard and seen that tulpamancy techniques have been able to help other types of systems with things like memory sharing, co-consciousness, and sharing control when those are not already present, because as I said, those are almost universal in tulpa systems, and doing the kinds of things that tulpas do have been shown to, at least in some cases, help with that. And on the other hand, the tulpamancy community has definitely absorbed a lot from other types of plurality over the last few years, especially when it comes to, equality and treating tulpas as people. Also a lot of the terminology. How about popular media? There are actually a couple of popular blogs and podcasts that have covered tulpas, such as Reply All, which is a podcast, and the website Vice. These, as you can probably imagine, have ranged from sympathetic and mostly accurate, which describes the Reply All podcast, to sensationalistic, which describes the Vice article. These still happen on occasion. There are good podcasts and bad podcasts, just like anything else. Tulpas have actually been a topic on some supernatural themed shows. I know Twin Peaks was a recent one, but their description of tulpas always seems to have very little resemblance to anything we do or anything done in Tibet. It's just more like what they did in 4chan, a sort of spooky subject. There was actually an episode on the American medical drama Chicago Med, one of those hospital shows, people get in accidents, they have to fix them up, where they had a tulpamancer as a subject on part of one episode. I think there were 3 separate sort of interlocking stories in that episode. One of them was about a tulpamancer that got in a car crash while trying to switch, I believe. That was actually based on a true story. I don't think the true story actually had the car crash, but other parts of it were based on the true story from one of those podcasts I mentioned earlier. So you do hear about tulpas occasionally in popular media. There's some YouTube videos and stuff like that as well. What about more scientific research? I know this is sometimes a controversial topic among some people, but the tulpamancy community definitely has an inkling toward research, an inkling toward surveys and studies. And there have been a lot of, there have been the censuses I described earlier. There have been a lot of studies, a lot of surveys. I've done a couple, mainly the one on switching. like I said, some of the data that I showed earlier comes from the censuses that have been done in the community. So there's really a strong proclivity towards those in the community. There hasn't been a lot of formal scientific research specifically about tulpas yet, but there is a study that's going to involve MRIs. So brain scans, a sort of long tube you lie down in. There's going to be several of those done on tulpa systems very shortly. And it's going to study how interacting with a tulpa, switching with a tulpa, compares to other mental states such as hypnosis and meditation and so on, and try to see what's actually going on when those things happen. Conclusions. Tulpamancy, as I said earlier, faces a lot of misunderstanding, confusion, and sometimes hostility, both from singlets, of course, and even other plural systems. I get it. I understand why people would be confused, would have misunderstandings, but at the same time, I and my tulpa and many others firmly believe that, especially in terms of other plural systems, the communities have a lot to learn from each other, a lot of ways we can support each other, and there's no reason for hostility, for arguments, for tearing each other down, for anything like that. I and many others have benefited tremendously from Tulpamancy in gaining lifelong companions, friends, and supporters, and of course, the joy of supporting and helping another person grow themselves. I'm not saying it's for everyone. I'm not saying you should do it or anyone else should do it, but it really has been a positive force for a lot of people. That is the end of my slides. I'm definitely willing to answer some questions. I'm told that a lot of the questions are there, and I believe they're beginning to be posted. So here's the first question. How do you address concerns about cultural appropriation, the idea that only Buddhists should be allowed to practice tulpamancy? So that's a very complex subject. It's not something I can fully address. To be honest, I don't know. I've never talked to a Tibetan Buddhist. I don't know what their opinion on it might be. I do have a couple of things to say about that, though. One is that a lot has changed since, Alexandria. There have been a lot of layers of separation. For one thing, I don't believe that what Alexandra David Neal wrote has much to do, is a completely accurate description of what she did there. And since then on the internet, the practices have been sort of changed over time to the point where I like to say that what we do has very little to do aside from the very general concept with what any Tibetan Buddhists are doing. It even, as I said, has a separate name. I don't know if Alexandra David Neal misheard or thought tulpa sounded better, but there's that. So of course, then you ask, why do we still call it tulpamancy? Words are very hard to change. I'm sure most of you have seen someone calling DID multiple personality disorder, despite the fact that it hasn't been called that for decades. So I wouldn't mind if we called them something else. It would probably be more accurate, but things like that are very hard to change. But most of us aren't really claiming to be closely associated to Buddhism. We're not, we're not pointing at that. We're not taking anything directly from them aside from the shadow of a name. So I don't think what we're doing is hurting Buddhists in any way. I understand if someone might be upset because, we did sort of take a name from them and now we're doing something completely different. They might not even necessarily agree with. I wish there could be a better way. We could remove ourselves completely from that. It might be a sort of cleaner break, but that's not always possible or easy to do. Do you ever see any hostility? Sorry, I'm just moving on to the next question. Do you ever see any hostility in the Tulpa community toward other system types? It certainly happens. I'm not going to say that it doesn't ever happen. I think there's just like with any community, there's certain people think that everyone else should work the same way they do. And obviously, as I said before, other system types don't work in the same way a lot of the time. So I do see some maybe skepticism and doubt when it's probably not warranted. I also see, I believe in an open community that people should be able to share information, and I run Tulpa Chat that way. There are other communities that are not. I don't know if you want to call that hostility. Certainly there are valid reasons to have a closed community. But broadly, I think that there's not a lot of hostility, at least in the parts of the community that I'm familiar with. I don't see people attacking traumagenic systems or non-Tulpa systems. I don't see a lot of that. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but I think that the amount of hostility out there is luckily pretty limited. Okay, how would you address concerns that people intentionally creating tulpas make it harder for those who don't control their system's creation to be taken seriously and get help when needed? So I know that is, one of the areas of concern from people. I'm not a psychologist, or I don't come from that perspective of someone that might think that. I don't think it's something that would happen. I think it's possible to keep a strong barrier to maintain that point of, I meant to do this, it makes me happy, versus I didn't mean to do this, it doesn't make me happy. I think it's possible to keep people aware of that distinction, to make sure that a psychologist, for example, or a therapist knows that, even if someone hypothetically knew about tulpas and knew that they were good, in most cases, to say that I did not mean to do this, it does not make me happy, it's a separate issue because, because of whatever, because we don't share memory. That's one of the criteria of DID, because it causes me distress in these ways. Tulpamancy is generally a form of healthy plurality. I know that even outside of Tulpamancy, there's a movement to show that having a system is not necessarily a bad thing. But that doesn't mean that, it can't be a bad thing. Certainly it can. I've seen stories of that. I've talked to people about it. I know as much about that as anyone else. So, well, not as much about that as anyone else, but I know about it. So I think that it's, I don't think it's a major concern at this time. I know that, there's a potential future, I can imagine it, where Tulpamancy is really well known and accepted, and DID patients or people with DID are maybe confused with that. I don't think that's likely to happen. I don't think that we're moving toward that. Very few people know about Tulpamancy. I don't think you're likely to see a psychologist, for example, that knows about it and misunderstands that. And I think that if Tulpamancy does become more popular, which I think a lot of people are hoping for, there's probably some education that needs to be done. Tulpamancers too, they want to show that this is not the same as a disorder, that this is not something that we need treatment for, that we experience distress from. I think it is useful to frame it in a way that DID does exist and we're not that. I think most people want to frame it in that way. And I think that is something that will probably happen. So I don't think I understand why people are concerned about it, but I don't think it's something that's likely to be a major issue in most cases. Okay, next question. Interesting. So what's the difference between tulpas and other system mates, or is it a blurry line? So as I said, the most common definition of tulpa is a system mate that's created deliberately. And definitely in a lot of cases, it can be a blurry line. We commonly call them tulpas, for example, come from pre-existing characters. For example, sorry, I don't mean pre-existing characters, I mean characters that someone has written, or imaginary friends. people can do things that are generally seen as related to tulpamancy without knowing that tulpas exist. People come on our tulpas, for example, all the time and say, oh, I didn't know, I had this person in my head I talked to who acts independently. And now that I see now that I see tulpas, I realize that that's just been what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing. So it can really be a blurry line in certain cases. Generally, if someone is created via trauma, we say that they're not a tulpa, but maybe someone has a really bad home life and they talk to themselves or they do things and that causes another systemate to form. It can be certainly a blurry line in a lot of scenarios. Not all, there are a lot of cases when someone specifically sits down and says, I'm going to create a tulpa, and they do. And that's not really unclear, but there are a lot of scenarios where it can be blurry, and a lot of these definitions are not fully agreed on by everyone. Okay, just waiting for okay, next question. What are Tulpa community perspectives on intra-system relationships? Okay, so this is intra, I-N-T-R-A. So that means within the same system. I'm pretty sure I'm not confusing that. It happens a lot. So as I said, they're quite common in the community. I don't think it's above 50%, but it's close. Certainly, I think most people understand why it happens. Most Tulpa relationships, even if they're not quote unquote relationships, most people have a very positive relationship with their Tulpa. They're very close to them. They're friends, they share things, they try to make each other happier. So I think almost everyone understands why a relationship would be formed. There are differing perspectives as to how healthy it is. Some people say you shouldn't have a relationship with your tulpa to the exclusion of other physical people. Other people say there's nothing wrong with that. That's really a debate that's still happening that you see flare up occasionally. But I think that almost everyone thinks that to some extent, it's it's good. Relationship stuff is always complicated, whether it's intrasystem or intersystem or singlets. But it's certainly a relatively common thing and something that makes a lot of people happy. Next question. Do tulpas grow out of the characters that they are modeled off of? I think especially in modern times, when tulpas are modeled off characters, this is something that does happen almost universally, where the character is really seen as more of just a base and maybe a form and personality that's easy to imagine, but over time they certainly learn and grow and develop and change. Yes, that is definitely an extremely common thing. Again, I should note, just to be clear, I don't know, this question was probably asked earlier, that probably most tulpas these days are not specifically modeled off of a character, but it is a thing that happens, and when it does, they certainly do grow beyond that. Next question. How much conflict do you see in the Tulpa community between headmates? For example, a created system member feeling like they wanted more time than they are given or something. So yeah, you do see those kinds of conflicts, certainly. There are different kinds of conflicts. That's obviously a popular one. The thing is that it's hard to explain. When you live in the same head and as tulpas and hosts, you share most information and memories and even a lot of traits. It's hard to really remain in open conflict for long. And oftentimes it's almost like it has to be encouraged. The way most tulpas are created, they're created via direct attention from the host. It often seems to create a sort of sense of obligation of, being very agreeable. I know that this is an issue that me and my tulpa went through as well, where, it can often be very difficult for them to feel like they're in a position to disagree or to ask for things. But there is that kind of conflict on occasion. it's something we see in the community. It's something we discuss. There are other types of conflict as well, where, they disagree with some decision, they disagree with, a relationship, something like that. But sort of the nature of how Tulpa systems work, where they share so much of their memories, sometimes even, thoughts and emotions, very easy to share. I think open conflict like that is perhaps rarer than you might expect, but it certainly happens. Next question. If you don't create tulpas for doing things for you, what's a common reason they're made? Companionship or something else? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you could create a tulpa to do things for you. I mean, well, sometimes you do see like people posting on Reddit saying, "Oh, I can create a tulpa to switch and do my homework, or to switch and talk to people because I have social anxiety." And they're almost always dissuaded, because that's even if it worked, which it doesn't really, that's not really a moral reason to do something. So yes, you're right, people don't generally create tulpas to do things for them. And probably the two biggest reasons to make them is, one, companionship, as you said, and two, curiosity. And we generally say don't make a tulpa just because you're curious. It's like, would you have a baby just because you're curious? I hope not. But certainly it almost always is part of it. People, they stumble across our tulpas just as I did, and they're really curious, and they want to see if it's possible and see how it works. For me, I think it was really a combination of those two reasons. I did want companionship, but I also had a lot of just curiosity. And to be honest, I wasn't really expecting it would work. It was more curiosity in the sense of, let me just try this. It's probably not going to work. And then I can, get rid of my curiosity and move on to something else. But I always knew that if it did work, then the companionship would be a really amazing thing. And, yeah, and it is. So yeah, I think it is a lot of companionship and curiosity, and those are probably the big two reasons you see. Would love to hear more about differences in attitude between tulpa systems, mixed origin systems that have tulpas in them, and tulpas who do not consider themselves part of the plural community. That's the next question. So that's a very broad question. Obviously people have a lot of differences in attitude. I guess I mostly want to address the latter one, tulpas who do not consider themselves part of the plural community. That's a thing that exists. I think, it's not a popular thing in the communities I'm in, but there are certainly people in the tulpa community who don't want to strongly associate with the rest of the plural community for varying reasons. Certainly they face a lot of different issues. They think that there can be confusion. They think that there can be misunderstandings. Maybe they don't want to associate with people who have a diagnosed mental illness. They don't want to be seen as being part of that, I guess. So there are those differences in attitude on occasion. I think you see that in some of the, exclusive communities, the communities that are just about tulpa issues. There is a part of that. I don't think it's a big thing, but it does exist. In terms of differences in attitude between tulpa systems and mixed origin systems that have tulpas in them, there's not really any broad differences that I can think of. They're just like anyone else. They accept that they came from a different place, of course, but I think a big thing where people are realizing with these mixed origin systems is that there don't necessarily have to be a lot of differences. That's where that thing I talked about earlier with how tulpamancy techniques can help other system mates more easily share information, share memories, things like that. So I'm not sure there are a lot of consistent differences in that sense between. Okay, next, sorry, I didn't have anything else to say. Next question. Are tulpa systems sometimes identified as quiogenic systems? I think I pronounced that word right. I have seen it before. So I don't know. I think it almost seems like the question should be reversed. Like if someone identifies as a quiogenic system, that means that they're, not strongly saying anything about their origin. maybe they don't want to think strongly about their origin. So in order to be a Tulpa system, sort of the definition says that you created them deliberately in some way. So, I guess it makes more sense to me to sort of ask the opposite question. Maybe someone who's a quiogenic system, someone that doesn't necessarily know how their system was formed, maybe they did something accidentally. Maybe they were. So one thing I wanted to mention earlier but didn't get to, there have been studies of authors, people who are writing characters, that found that a large portion of the time, I think it was something like 60 or 70%, they reported things like their characters, talking back to them and expressing surprising opinions about what should happen in the story, things like that. So that goes to part of the unintentional tulpa / walk-in question of, when you do things like talk to an imaginary friend or think a lot about a character you're writing, they can sort of become a system member in some ways. And for a lot of authors, that probably goes away after they're done with the book, but for some, maybe it doesn't. So I think some people that maybe are not sure how their system formed, they did something along those lines. I'm certainly not saying it happens in most cases or all cases, but that's possible. And maybe that was what the question was. Yeah, next question. I do wonder how tulpas tend to see themselves. Like, do some ever feel less valid because they were created? That's certainly a thing that happens, yes. There's angst you see in tulpa communities from tulpas that worry about their own realness, about their own worth because of that. That's, a common thing that happens. Yeah, I'm lucky enough to say that my tulpa does not have that question. She's always been very convinced of her own realness and her own validity. But that is a thing that you see, unfortunately. If you mean tulpas versus other types of system members, sorry, maybe that's what you meant, created versus coming from trauma, for example. I haven't seen that. It's certainly not a kind of thing the tulpa community would encourage. Maybe in other mixed communities. I know there are unfortunately people out there that attack tulpas for things like that, so I guess it's possible, but it's not really something I've seen. Okay, one more question. Are there good spaces where DID systems can discuss issues with tulpamancers to bridge the communities and share resources with each other? So in terms of communities I know, certainly the best place would be Discord. Like I said, there's a lot of an increasing number of open spaces there, of spaces that welcome DID systems, tulpamancers, and other types of systems, and that are about bridging the communities and sharing resources. Again, the server I am in charge of, Tulpa Chat, is obviously primarily about tulpas, but we do accept people of any system types and singlets, of course. We do have a couple systems that identify as traumagenic. So I'm not saying it's the best place, but you're certainly welcome there. Probably the best place for finding other servers would be a Discord server called Plural Hub. I believe they're setting up a website now, so if you look it up and Google it, I think you should be able to find it. There might also be someone in the chat, for example, that is in Plural Hub and can post a link, something like that. So yeah, there are a lot of different servers like that, some of which are just casual and for fun. Others are, about discussing serious information, sharing issues, things like that. So those, yeah, there definitely are good spaces like that. Okay, are there any more questions? I'm told there may not be any more questions. I think we have about 5 minutes, so if anything has come up, you might want to get it in very quickly. I can't see the chat right now, I'm sorry. Are there any more questions? I'm asking the little host of this thing who is sharing the questions with me.
I don't think so. Um, this is the Chris's. Hi, everybody. I don't think we have any more questions for you. That was quite a lot of questions.
Well, it's good. I wanted to answer questions. I got out a lot of information, and hopefully, a lot of people's questions were answered both through my slides and what they asked.
Yeah, I think so. And I really want to thank you. This has been very enlightening. As somebody who knows definitely a dangerous amount about tulpamancy, which means very little, I really appreciate your time in helping to educate everybody and talking more about the possibilities of inclusion, and passing information between different communities in the
Yeah,
plural umbrella.
I definitely see that it's already happened, and I think it's been helpful on both sides, and hopefully it can continue in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And everybody else, the chat will end very, very briefly after I end the meeting. So um, be well, and everybody take good care of yourselves.
Same. Thank you all.